What's up, A-Push Nation? It's Mr. Smith, and today we're talking about the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings is an interesting title for a period of American history that lasted from about the end of the War of 1812 up into the time that Andrew Jackson came to power in the mid-1820s. So we've got a lot of time to unpack here, about a decade's worth of American history. And I'm going to consolidate it by talking about some key themes along the way. Now, for my class, we've got some team trivia action coming up this Thursday. But for anyone else out there watching, hopefully this helps you guys secure those A-Push points. In fact, if you were to pull up the 2002 DBQ, the ancient style of DBQ, you would find the year that I took it, my junior year of high school. The era of good feelings was the DBQ topic. So I've always felt a bit of bias towards the importance of the era of good feelings, thanks in part to the torturous experience that we had back when the DBQ was 10 documents and not this soft 5 or 6 document that you guys have to now work with. But regardless, enough said from this old man shaking fist at sky, this curmudgeon. Let's get down to business. So when it comes to the era of good feelings, I like starting off with this classic painting. The era of good feelings portrayed the United States as a happy-go-lucky new nation, ready to conquer the challenges that came with asserting itself following the victory over the British, not once, but 2 L's for the British since the War of 1812 concluded with an American victory. More on that in a moment. Don't be shocked to see this as a possible primary source on an MCQ or a stimulus on the SAQs, but this painting encapsulates the good vibes, the good times that the United States was enduring after winning the War of 1812. So let's really start with this idea of what broke down the painting and kind of led to the good vibes that we see here in the background of this painting. And we can't talk about the era of good feelings, by the way, without segueing with a little flow rider. So let's get this party started a little bit here, A-Push Nation. Gotta let it sit, right? All right. Thanks, Flow Rider, for the transition. I'm sure I'm getting all sorts of critiques here on my YouTube page. But anyways, I'm going to break down the era of good feelings into a few categories that ultimately the last point that I raise is one that I think is the most significant and the one that you're most likely to get on the A-Push exam, which is that it ushers in this spirit of true American independence. The United States has finally vanquished the British, and that includes issues such as arming Native Americans in the West, impressment on the seas, some of the trade negotiations that went south with things like Jay's Treaty. So the U.S. really finally sheds itself of the British, and this kind of leads to this era of true American independence, no more relying on the British or no more really dealing with British issues. That's not to say there won't be some foreign matters that come up involving the British down the road, but for now, in this new era of U.S. history, the British are sort of vanquished and once and for all gone as a thorn in the American side. Other key themes, and this really is how the United States achieved that true American independence, that's going to be winning the War of 1812. As you all know by now, the A-Push exam is not one for military history. So with all due respect to some of the heroes of the War of 1812 and some of the great battles, and I will mention at least one of them, the war itself is not going to be what you'll be assessed on. But, certainly there were some highlights that should be memorable about the War of 1812, a war which the United States almost lost. I mean, heck, the British burned not only the executive mansion, which is what the White House used to be called, but it also burned the Capitol building. And so these are scarring moments in Washington, D.C. history, a city that was pretty relatively new. D.C. had only existed for about a decade or so due to the compromise between Federalists and Dem reps, choosing that as the site of the nation's capital in what used to be considered the southern part of the U.S. But ultimately, the United States prevailed, much in part thanks to its Navy. And a little bit of, past shapes future here. If it weren't for the Barbary Wars during Jefferson's era, the United States didn't have as solid a Navy prior to the Barbary Wars. And so the Barbary Wars proved to be vital to the U.S. success in the War of 1812. Some of the great battles in that war took place in Canada and in the Great Lakes region of the United States. And that really propelled the U.S. to a stunning victory once again against the British. And this would be the second L in American history for the Brits. But during the war, an interesting sort of dynamic that I want to bring up, and this is sort of, I guess you could argue, one of the last sort of battles within America's two-party system, the partisanship that developed after George Washington became president, which is the Dem Reps versus the Federalists. In Hartford, Connecticut, towards the end of the war, the Federalists launched a bid to end the war. They merged forces in Hartford, and the idea being that they wanted to put some pressure on the Dem Reps to ultimately sign a treaty to end the war with the British. The Federalists failed at this in this moment. They did not succeed at the Hartford Convention, and the Dem Reps saw this as betrayal. They saw this as an act of treason to some degree, not literally prosecuted as treason, but members of the Federalist Party that attended the Hartford Convention were ridiculed. More on that in a moment. And see, the Dem Reps really sort of solidified their power over the national government here. This is arguably one of the first times in American history we get talks of secession. There were some radical Federalists that were talking about leaving the United States over their beef with the war. But in the end, there was nobody leaving the Union yet, although we know that's driving forward towards that in the 1800s. But this was a stunning moment for the Federalist Party, and one that would contribute to their gradual and eventual decline in American politics during the era of good feelings. But something that came about as a result of the war, the British used their native alliances and they allied with native groups all over the United States, the Cherokee, some of the tribes in the Midwest that took part in the Prophet Tecumseh's rebellion that came before the War of 1812. But many of these native groups were hung out to dry. The British abandoned their allies when the war ended. They did not negotiate anything about the natives into the Treaty of Ghent, which was the treaty that ended the war in 1815. And many of the native groups were just left to fend for themselves. And as we've established throughout the year so far in APUSH, this is going to lead to further encroachment of native lands. More U.S. treaties are going to come as a result of the British no longer backing their native allies. And that was a tough blow for the Native American movement. You know, natives have long endured suffering since the arrival of white Europeans at the end of the 15th century. And now, as part of this new era of good American feelings, there's going to be a renewed sense to remove natives from their land. More on that later. And finally, new political heroes are going to emerge. Some of the most famous American congressmen and senators are going to really steer the United States into this new era. Names like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, John Quincy Adams, James Monroe. These are going to be some of the big names in the era of good feelings and beyond. So a little overview here, and then we'll dive deeper into the conflicts themselves. I already mentioned the war and how the battles and the strategy is not going to be what you're most going to be responsible for. But I think it's just, again, a good reminder of how the United States secured the victory by really relying on its Navy. The British strategy was to sort of cut off the United States from supplies from other European powers, like we know was a big deal in the Revolutionary War. But the culminative battle of the war was down in New Orleans. And it was actually an interesting moment in Andrew Jackson's career because Jackson led the successful campaign of the United States. Interestingly, the battle was fought after the treaty was signed. And it's a reminder of how long information took sometimes to travel the Atlantic, because while the American diplomats and the British diplomats were signing a peace treaty in Europe, Jackson did not get the memo, and hundreds and thousands of people died even though the war was over. So it's kind of a sad ending to the war, but it did lead to the United States gaining more and more territory from the British. It also led to America solidifying its position in Louisiana, that key Mississippi River Delta region. So this is a big victory for the United States, despite the loss. And again, despite the fact that D.C. was burned. And you also get memorable moments like, for example, the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, which would ultimately become the national anthem later in American history. I've always found it interesting that Francis Scott Key, the author and the observer of one of the battles in the war, it was a battle that took place at Fort McHenry, just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Eventually, Francis Scott Key's poem got turned into the jingle that became the Star Spangled Banner. And interestingly, when the Americans first married the poetry to the lyrics, and made it into more of a song, they took a British drinking song as the melody, and that's where the Star Spangled Banner came from. So it's kind of an interesting little dinner party knowledge fact there about the writing of the Star Spangled Banner, and then also how it eventually became the national anthem. I mentioned the Hartford Convention earlier as this moment of Federalist weakness. Interestingly, the Dem reps seized the opportunity to ridicule the Federalists. This cartoon here sort of chides at the Federalists who were leaping towards the King of England and who were leaping away from America. So the Dem reps took no exception here. They really vilified the Federalists that took part in that Hartford Convention. And this is a great primary source, as well as another coming up here momentarily that will call upon people's memories of the Hartford Convention. I mentioned the abandonment of the Native Americans, and that's going to lead to further conflicts. And look who comes in to the conflict here, Andrew Jackson. Shortly after the War of 1812 ended, Jackson would remain in the military before he transitioned to politics. And Jackson took on the role of fighting numerous Native wars in the Deep South, where the United States was trying to rid natives from the land. This all fit, of course, the Dem Rep agrarian vision. And one of the most famous cases of that is the Seminole Wars. Now, there were a series of these battles against Native Americans in the modern-day Georgia and Florida region, and the Seminole were one of the fiercest, most advanced tribes in that neck of the woods. But Jackson led an unprovoked attack on Florida, which, by the way, was still, in this point, Spanish Florida. Allegedly, the Spanish claimed that Jackson invaded Florida illegally, without provocation, without any sorts of warning, which in fact did turn out to be the case in Jackson's involvement and the troops there. And this is going to lead to just a brutal war between natives living in Spanish Florida and the United States government. So the U.S. government did not stop with the War of 1812. Although it did stop fighting the British, it would not stop fighting allies. That is natives. That is a continuity right there in the 1800s, the continual ongoing wars with natives. And this, again, will reinforce Andrew Jackson's reputation as a tough soldier that will propel him to the presidency within the next 10 years. But for the Seminole and other tribes in the Southeast, this was America's new epicenter of war against Native Americans. The southeastern United States is where we will see the U.S. government make a concerted effort to take land from those natives. And this is going to spell disaster as a harbinger of future land eviction for natives in the Southeast. Speaking of Andrew Jackson and some of these political titans that are going to emerge in the era of good feelings, to set things up, I want to go back to the Hartford Convention with the Federalist moment of weakness and really focus on this graphic here. This was an 1816 election propaganda cartoon that the Dem reps created. Notice how the Hartford Convention candidate is looking like somewhat of a demon there compared to Columbia, the former symbol of the United States. We don't see Columbia any longer. We see more like caricatures like Uncle Sam standing in as the United States. But back in the day, Columbia was seen as a Roman goddess, was sort of the embodiment of the United States in a lot of political cartoons, next to the bald eagle. Fun fact, by the way, before he passed away, Ben Franklin tried to push the turkey as the official bird of the United States, but he was outnumbered in that argument in favor of the bald eagle. Now, this demon figure, kind of interesting. It's actually what's called a Krampus. You might have heard of the Krampus because there was a 2015 horror movie about the Krampus made. Krampus is like an evil villain that haunts it comes from German culture, that haunts little children who are bad during Christmas time. For whatever reason, the Americans sort of went with the Krampus here, demon spirit, as the sort of embodiment of the Federalists. And in the election of 1816, where now another Dem rep will step down after 2 terms, Madison was out in 1816, and in stepped James Monroe. Monroe was a former Revolutionary War soldier. He's the last of the Revolutionary War soldiers that would be elected president. He leads a commanding victory over Rufus King, everybody's favorite Federalist from 1816. Notice where the Federalists have their stronghold. It's Massachusetts, which, again, still at this point, included Maine. It's pretty much a Dem rep domination here once again. Notice Louisiana became a state in time for the election after the War of 1812. Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York remain the largest states in the Union. So the Dem reps continue to dominate, and that's a trend that continues into 1820. Although look what happened here. There is not a single Dem rep state that doesn't go the Dem reps way. Monroe wins back-to-back elections. This is an interesting distinction here. 6 straight Dem reps are elected. The Federalist Party is all but cooked now, and there wasn't even a Federalist candidate. What happened, interestingly, in New Hampshire is that a couple electors voted for John Quincy Adams, and that was only for one reason: to preserve George Washington's record of winning a clean sheet on an election. The Dem reps wanted to preserve Washington's legacy, but this is the end of Washington's former party, the Federalist Party. The party will no longer exist following 1820, so note that as an important change over time in American politics. And this is a little DPK for my guys, but also for everybody else. So I'm going to leave my students hanging a little bit here, but I will ask a question from where the majority of America's first 4 out of 5 presidents came from the same state. So a little bit for the team trivia. Now, with new American political system heroes emerging, we've got a really big topic we're going to get to before we conclude this video. And that's going to come from Henry Clay, who will go down as one of America's most legendary statesmen who never won the presidency. And the term to remember here with Henry Clay to associate with him is the American system. The American system is sort of Clay's version of an updated Hamilton's economic plan. Excuse me, Clay was a longtime senator and representative from Kentucky. He served in both House and Senate during his time. And Clay launched in 1816 a new economic plan in the era of good feelings to steer the United States towards true economic independence and growth. It's very reminiscent of Hamilton's economic plan. Why? Because one, Clay championed the idea of a high protective tariff. That was something that Hamilton believed in. That was something that the United States leaned on. That is something that the United States politicians still today talk about, the importance of a high protective tariff to promote the growth of American industry. Clay also proposed the renewal of a new bank. The original charter of Hamilton's plan called for the bank to be expunged. And so Clay asked for Congress to create a new national bank, which it would do in 1816. More on the bank problems later on in the class year. But here's the big winner of Clay's plan. Not only did it promote sort of the tariff, a new bank, but it wanted to boost the American economy by investing money into projects at the state level, mostly for roads and canals. Roads and canals are going to be the new sort of fabric of America's transportation system, its infrastructure system. And Clay's theory and the supporters of Clay's plan in the Dem Rep Party believed that through roads and canals, America would become more interconnected, and that would unify the states through trade. North, South could not only be connected now via the water, but could be connected more concertedly through roads and canals. We're going to do a bit in my class more on this, but for everybody else out there, know that roads and canals are a staple of the Henry Clay American system. And something that I want you guys thinking about, how could this be seen as a partisan issue? Well, remember, North, South, we're not really quite to the sectionalism, the era that's going to blow up in the 1800s. But again, continuing to understand how Americans could be divided, farmers were especially put off by some of these Henry Clay American system plans, just like farmers and sort of lower level agricultural or laborers would have been with Hamilton's plan, because it did seem to favor the sort of elite, wealthy merchant class, which tended to be more northern based. And over time, we're going to start to see when this sectionalism idea emerges, North versus South. A big cause of North versus South sectionalism will be the economy. And when my class returns from our little mini October holiday, we're going to talk more about the growing sectional tension as it relates to American industry and the economy. But speaking of other political heroes beyond Henry Clay, let's talk about John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, and he's going to emerge as James Monroe's chosen Secretary of State. Remember, Secretary of States are appointed and confirmed. They are not elected. So yes, it's that Adams family that's back. John Quincy Adams would gain a lot of notoriety for negotiating the surrender and the purchase of Florida from Spain. This was more American territory, and it ties back to what we learned about earlier on the video, talking about the wars against Seminole natives in Florida. So James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, pulls off a major victory for the United States in what is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. I might not be pronouncing that Spanish name properly, so I do apologize. If it was a French name, I'd probably nail it a little better with my my attempt at French, and my French accent is not too bad. But anyways, the point being, James Monroe, Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, pulls off a big moment in American history to acquire Florida. And then let's run it back here with Adams and Monroe teaming up to steer American foreign policy into a new era, as the era of good feelings would start to come to an end in the 1820s. What you're seeing here is an excerpt from the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine was a staple of the American foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine is going to create a foreign policy that's going to extend well into the 20th century. So this is one of the last topics I want to hit you guys with. The Monroe Doctrine is a continuity in American history because it's going to last over 100 years, but it's also a change over time because it's going to be an issue in which the U.S. is going to start to emerge as a more tough, durable country when it comes to foreign policy. And if we go back now to the words, what we can pull out of this Monroe Doctrine is that basically the U.S. was warning foreign nations, especially European powers, to not mix it up in the Western Hemisphere. Around this time, Spain was dealing with a whole slew of revolutions in South America. Mexico had broken away from Spain, and the U.S. had fears that Spain might want to overstep its reach in the Western Hemisphere and mix it up with the United States a bit. Plus, don't forget, this is coming out of the sort of Napoleonic Wars, the trauma of those wars, the War of 1812. So here's the U.S. emerging as a more confident, more assured nation, and they're basically issuing this statement in 1823, which becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, to leave the United States alone. To quote, "With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition from the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States." In other words, don't mess with the U.S., baby. This is a new United States, an emerging young nation wanting to stamp itself in the world as a country that would run the Western Hemisphere. And this is what the era of good feelings really is all about. And so, as I end the presentation today, as always, I'll remind you the past shapes the future. Don't take the era of good feelings lightly. It is an era in which the United States is changing its tune, both domestically and foreign, and we will see shortly how the era of good feelings does contribute to the eventual oncoming sectionalism crisis that's going to propel the United States into the Civil War. For now, as always, the past shapes the future. A Push Nation, take care. Mr. Smith, signing off.